Welcome to this week's class, our first video class. As you may remember, we're going to have another video class next week, and I look forward to seeing you again in a couple of weeks. So, the agenda for tonight's class is on differentiated instruction. And we will define it, make sure we understand what that means, where it developed from, where it came from, and focus on strategies for differentiation. And while there's a group activity, I'll be asking that you do a little bit of reflection on your own, and we can come back together in a couple of weeks and talk about it. We've been talking about differentiation all semester long. As you know, we focused on UDL, which are modifications that benefit all students, as well as Tier 1 RTI interventions that benefit all students. And tonight we're going to move our focus more towards the individual student, which we started to do last week with talking about individual profiles. So let's begin.
Mr. Grimes, mathematics teacher, is displeased with the progress of his 9th grade class in mathematics. You see what low grades you made on your weekly mathematics test? More than half of you failed. Most of those who passed just got by. Nobody had 100%. This is the poorest class I've had in a long, long time. Most of you have no foundation at all. Now, the trouble's with your attitude. You don't pay enough attention in class. You don't do enough work outside of it. You don't know what the word study means. You haven't the slightest idea. Don't you realize that mathematics is an important subject? I tell you right now that unless you get over your lazy habits and come up to the standards I've set for this class, many of you will have the pleasure of repeating this course next semester.
Okay, so hopefully you realize that this is not an example of best practices in education. It is not an example of a differentiated class. It's the polar opposite. It is a very traditional setting where all the students are basically looking towards the teacher for the source of information, and if you don't succeed in that manner, you don't succeed at all. So hopefully we're going to move as far away from this type of classroom as possible. So when we talk about differentiated instruction, as I mentioned in class last week, Carol Ann Tomlinson is the guru of differentiated instruction. She made all educators be aware of the concept, help to develop strategies, and many of us who continue to work in facilitating differentiated instruction owe everything to her. Carol Ann Tomlinson defines differentiated instruction as shaking up what goes on in the classroom so that students have multiple options for taking in information, making sense of ideas, and expressing what they learn. So it pretty simply stated, it's multiple options for learning and expressing what they learn. There are other definitions, obviously, that fit in very nicely with this. We can say we start where the students are and we educate from that point. We can also define differentiation as addressing the needs of individual students and small groups of students to maximize learning opportunities. Another definition would be a process to enhance learning to improve the match between the learner's unique characteristics and the various curriculum components. So we can say this a number of ways, and it's important that you be able to say it in your own language, in a way that makes sense to you. So that's why I'm providing a couple of different ways to say this. So there are certain assumptions that go on in a differentiated classroom. the idea that students differ as learners. We don't all learn the same. I think we've addressed this very much this semester. The idea that educators have an obligation to recognize and respond to these differences. I believe very strongly that teachers must accept the fact that students have different learning abilities and preferences, and it is their obligation to meet those individual student needs. And if you don't recognize that, I don't think you belong in a classroom. Another assumption is, in order to learn well, each student needs appropriate challenge, success, and learning experiences. That makes sense. I want to emphasize here the challenge. It's not, differentiation is not about making it easier for students. We're not trying to make it simpler. We're trying to keep the challenge, but an appropriate challenge where a student can succeed. Another assumption is that we responding to academic differences needs to take place in an environment of mutual respect and safety, with an emphasis on growth and shared responsibility for student learning. So when we talk about safety, I think many of you have already realized that the word safety does not simply mean physical safety. That is a piece of it. But it's emotional safety and social safety. And we have to create an environment, a positive classroom environment that allows children to feel comfortable with their differences and take responsibility and feel good about those differences. Another assumption is attending to students' differences requires a flexible approach to teaching. So I think we all know that because our students are so different, if we are not flexible, we will fail as teachers, and that will inevitably lead students to fail as learners. But if we are flexible, we can help students be successful. Successful attention to student differences must be rooted in solid curriculum and instruction. So a good differentiated classroom is not fluff. It's not making it all fun and engaging. That's good. I believe in that. That's a good piece of it. But you can't have fun and engaging and modified if we don't have a solid curriculum and good instructional strategies and techniques. So everything, I think our focus should start with the student, but I think the curriculum and instruction piece is just as important. They go hand in hand. There are many routes to achieving high quality curriculum taught in ways that attend to student differences and build community. So there's not a prescription for differentiation. I'm not going to tell you the way to do it. You're going to find the way to do it that fits with your own teaching style as well as your own students' needs. And lastly, developing differentiated classrooms calls on educators to rethink teaching, learning, and assessment. The good part about beginning your journeys as teachers is you can form really effective and positive strategies about teaching. It's much harder if you've been doing it in a traditional way for a long time, and then you're challenged to rethink. So you're going to be really creating your thinking strategies from scratch. So there are certain principles that define what differentiation is. Principle number one is teachers who see the strengths in students teach positively. I think, we've emphasized the idea of a positive classroom community, and it's not just that you're doing it because you have to. You're stuck with kids of all these different learning abilities and styles, and you have to adapt. So you do it grudgingly. in a differentiated classroom, teachers are very happy to do it. They want to do it. They want to see the strengths in students. It's not hard for them to look beyond students' weaknesses and see the strengths. Principle 2, teaching to students' strengths helps students to see themselves positively. That's seems very obvious to me that if teachers respectfully see students' varying abilities as a positive and not as a hindrance or a weakness, that students will see their own themselves as well as their ability to learn in a positive way. And different Okay, so teaching to students' strengths helps students to see strengths in one another. That goes on with this community that we're building, that not only we value our own way of learning, but we have respect for other students in our class and their way of learning. We don't look down upon students with a disability because we learn differently than they do. Teaching to students' strengths helps students to see learning positively. And lastly, teaching to students' strengths helps students overcome weaknesses. That's really the idea, is to help students look at their, whether we're going to call it weaknesses or in some cases disabilities, as not an obstacle. It's just a path, and it's positive, and they're still going to get success. So one of the things that I want to point out are some fallacies about differentiation. Differentiation doesn't mean you individualize instruction for each and every student. You are not creating 20 lesson plans or 25 lesson plans. Instead, you think about that one-room schoolhouse where students are sometimes working as a whole group, sometimes they're working in small groups, and sometimes they're working individually, or you're working with students individually in all these settings. It's not, again, 25 individual plans. It's just a coordinated effort of many things going on at the same time. I believe I use the term three-ring circus as others have used it. I don't want the idea of a circus to give the idea that a differentiated classroom is chaotic. If it is chaotic, it's something that needs to be tweaked. That's not an effective way for students to learn. I envision, and I see it in practice, a well-choreographed and well-coordinated classroom where many things are happening simultaneously, but it is seamless in the process and students are moving well. And differentiation is not just for the outliers, the outliers, the struggling students or the gifted students. It's really for every student. So I want you to think about differentiation as proactive. It's not something you wait to do when a student is struggling. You start your year out with the idea of evaluating students' learning profiles and creating multiple opportunities, multiple options for learning in your classroom through multiple intelligences and different levels of ability and time that students need to complete assignments. And differentiation is not just qualitative, it's not just quantitatively different. It's not more work or less work. It's just different work. And as we've said before, and we'll say again, differentiation is rooted in assessment. You can't differentiate if you don't know where your students are at any particular point. And assessments, as I've said, is not about state test assessments that take a long time to get back. It's the ongoing assessments that you lead in a classroom. So in Carol Tomlinson's framework, we are meeting the needs of each student in heterogeneous classrooms by adapting the content. The content is what we teach, the knowledge, understanding, the skills we want students to learn. So we're adapting the curriculum. We may be adapting the readings, the resources, assignments. We are adapting the processes. The process is how we teach students what we want them to learn, how the students come to understand or make sense of that content. We adapt our methods and our strategies, our learning activities. An example would be highlighting text for student ahead of time, or providing a word bank or a glossary for students. So we're not, in changing the processes, it's how we teach, not what we teach. We're also adapting the product. The product is how students show us what they've learned, how they demonstrate that they understand or know or are able to do what we've asked them to do after a period of time. And so that means we have to have a variety of ways to assess students' knowledge and ability and learning. So we may have a different set of questions for different students that will allow us to get to that same answer of what they've learned. We might have a word bank for some students to access, a word bank on the assessment, so that students can get a little more support in answering the questions, so that we find out that a student really does know something. And we adapt the affect, which are students' emotions and feelings about their learning. This is an integral part of their learning, as you know. So teachers have the ability to modify the whole aura of the learning environment, and to make learning an enjoyable experience and a successful experience, which I think goes along with building relationships, not only as the whole, building relationships with the whole group, but building relationships with individual students. So now we're going to dig in a little bit more and talk about how do we actually differentiate. So we can differentiate by students' readiness. So that means their ability level, or the pace in which they learn, or in some cases, their English proficiency. So we are basically understanding that students are not at the same starting point in their ability, where they are in their knowledge or skill level, where they start with, or in how quickly they learn. So we will adapt based on students' levels. So you might actually group students based on their readiness levels. But not always, which we'll get back to a little bit later. You can also differentiate by interest. So this is where you develop highly motivating activities and provide choice. I've said it before, I think differentiating by choice is one of the easiest ways, because then students become more interested and engaged. And as we said a few minutes ago, that affect piece is a crucial part of the learning experience. And another way that we can differentiate and should differentiate is by learning profile, which you understand is the combination of all information you have about the student. It is certainly their multiple intelligence, it may be their learning profile, it may be their culture, gender, or other issues that you have observed and are aware of that impact learning. So we don't ignore those other factors. We put those other factors in consideration. Last week in class, we had a couple of examples of students who moved from a different location. That impacts their learning profile. A student whose parents may be in the middle of a divorce could in fact impact a student's learning profile, at least temporarily. Excuse me. So the big question is why to differentiate. Here is where I would love to have a conversation with you and hear from you about all the reasons that you know it is important to customize our instruction to meet the needs of our learners. We know, excuse me, that one size does not fit all. In that example I showed you in the beginning of class, if that example was taking place today, and I see various, versions of that type of model, and we get a very small number of students who are able to succeed in that kind of model. Another reason is if we look at data. So data that I have here on our right is from, we call it NAEP, NAEP, or the National Association of Education Progress. This is also known as the National Report Card. So this is how we look at students across the country and see how they're doing. What we know is, as we've measured students' progress over the years, is that there have really been a downward trend in students' success. And I don't have the latest data here for you, where we're starting to see an upward trend. Actually, right here you see 2014. So you see, right. So we have different years here, which are, we're starting to see some increase in achievement based on hopefully the Common Core and improved differentiation in the classroom. But we can also look at this data and say, wow, our students, if we look at math ability at the 8th grade level, in 2015, we see only 33% of our students nationally are meeting grade level expectations. And that is problematic. So we're spending a lot of time saying that whatever we've been doing these past years is not working, and we need to do a better job. I will also say that we have done a terrible job with the gifted and talented, especially since high stakes testing has come to be so important in terms of funding sources. And schools will say, well, I have to worry about my weakest students. I have to provide extra support for my students who are going to do poorly on state tests and national tests. And therefore, I don't have to worry about my gifted students. They'll do just fine on the tests. But I think that's really an unfortunate thing that we've done, is to kind of forget about our gifted students. And there's some research that shows that we only challenge half of our gifted students about half of the time. So recently, we've had some federal laws that have been enacted. Well, not so recently, but certainly No Child Left Behind, and the Education for ESSA, always forget what those initials are federal laws enacted to protect our weakest student, and lots of money for them, but little for our highest students. So I will also say that more than 50% of our gifted students are considered underachievers, and we know that 20% of our gifted students end up dropping out before they get to high school. So by the time they finish high school. So what I'm saying is, we can't just pay attention to our struggling students. We must find a way to effectively challenge our gifted students, which is not through more work. Helping gifted students, it's not about finish your work, I'll give you more work to do. That is not motivating for students, and that does not encourage them to achieve. What we have to do is give them different work to do, differentiated work that fits their readiness level, their interests, and obviously their learning profiles. So I'd like to show you an example of a differentiated class. And obviously, I want to hear what you think, but I want you to pay attention. I want you to note what you think are examples of differentiated strategies that this fourth grade teacher is using. So this is a 3.5 minute video. I will say it is edited, so you are not seeing the hour-long lesson. But hopefully you can get some ideas of some strategies that this teacher uses.
Ladies and gentlemen, when you go inside, I'm going to hand you one of 3 different colored entrance cards. Your job is to go in, put your first and last name and the dates on your paper, and complete your exit or entrance card silently. Think about your measures of central tendency and look at the data set. Which measure of central tendency makes sense with that statement? Ladies and gentlemen, please put your pencils down and your calculators aside. When you came in, I gave you one of 3 different colored entrance cards. You are now going to pair up with 2 other people, making it small groups of 3. Your groups of 3 will have 1 blue sheet, 1 yellow sheet, and 1 pink sheet. So, if I could please have Alex, Sammy, and Michelle, you will be my first group. Okay, you can go ahead, and when you are in your groups, you're going to be discussing the following questions. We have started to make claims using our measures of central tendency. You are going to go to centers today to continue to practice making statements about a data set. The data sets will be given to you, or depending on your center, you will create your data sets. And you're going to analyze that data and make claims about them. So when you were doing your warm-up, your entrance cards this morning, I gave you a colored Post-it note. Please remember what color Post-it note you had. If you got a teal colored Post-it note, you're going to be doing the center at table 3 called In the Bag. You are going to, as a group, look at the provided examples of data sets and statements in the large plastic bag. Then with partners, you're going to look at small data sets and discuss. And then as individuals, you are going to write a VCR that explains how you know which measure of central tendency was used to create a claim. The directions are on the front of the center. I will leave the center at table 3. Do not move until I tell you to. At this time, I would like a silent transition to your center.
So, again, I'd really love to hear your reactions, and I'm going to ask you about them when we're back together. But I'm going to point out some examples of differentiation. Certainly, she greeted the students at the door before they came into her class, and she clarified expectations. Whether you call this a differentiation strategy, good teaching strategy, or a good classroom management strategy, I don't care, but it's a good way to avoid having to correct students after. They know what to do. Another example of differentiation is that students were given 3 colors of entrance cards. They were basically differentiated do now activities. So the task was to create random groups for 3 for student talk groups, and each student analyzed data based on a different claim. And so they had different activities going on those different sheets based on what she knew about the students the day before. During the independent work, she provided support as needed. And she also gave them different color sticky notes. You might have noticed that as she was walking away, she gave them different color sticky notes. And that helped her to place the students in various center activities. And there were 3 levels. There was an accelerated group, a practice group, and a guided group. I understand that you couldn't see all of this. Some of this I know from watching the entire video, and I hope you got to see some of this in action. Certainly using centers is an example of differentiated practice. And of course, she clarified the task both verbally and in writing for the students before they left. Note the chart paper that she had on her board ahead of time. She didn't have a smartboard or an interactive whiteboard, and so she, I thought, very smoothly provided that instruction at the right time and didn't leave it out ahead of time when it would just be extraneous information for the students. We can certainly think about classroom management as a piece of differentiation. To me, they moved around like that coordinated effort that I've spoken about before. And the students have had a lot of experience moving around the classroom, working in different groups, and they certainly knew what was expected and was able to do that ahead of time. And one of the things that you didn't get to see, what the students had an exit card, which helped the teacher, an exit card with a very simple task, and the teacher was able to then take that information and use that information to create groups and modify her learning for tomorrow. I do recognize that in the past when I've shown this video, some teachers didn't like it for various reasons. So just because I do doesn't mean it's perfect, but hopefully you can extrapolate from this some pretty good strategies. But again, I look forward to hearing what you think about this video when we come back. So now what we're going to start doing is digging into some differentiated strategies. You'll see on the Moodle there is a list of differentiated strategies. That list is in no way totally inclusive. You'll certainly read about lots of strategies in your text, your Tomlinson text. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the ones that I think are the key strategies that should be implemented in a differentiation classroom. Again, I hope it doesn't sound contradictory. I've said you get to choose how you implement it, and at the same time, I'm telling you these are the big ones. But I do feel that these strategies can be implemented in different ways that meet your style, but are really important. So small group instruction, which we've talked about many times before in the classroom, we know that small group instruction is more effective than whole group instruction. We have a lot of research that shows us that group size is critical for student learning. Very important. It's more important than ratio. It's not more important than the effectiveness of the teacher, but we do know that small group on many, many measures is just more effective. So you could do the exact same thing you do in a whole group. You do it in a small group, the students will be more successful. And why is that? Well, again, I want to hear your ideas and I hope you reflect on them, but we get to see and hear children's responses. So instead of 20 or 25 students, you now, and you can see it in this picture where the teacher is at the kidney-shaped table, there's only a few students that she needs to look at, observe, listen to, and she can really focus on gauging their thinking processes, and students will speak more. Students who are reluctant to speak in a large group will also be more likely to engage and take a chance, take that risk in a small group. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about co-teaching models that involve small group instruction. You may recall some of the Marilyn Friend models of co-teaching that involve small group is station teaching. So instead of the students in a whole group, they are rotating to different areas of the room. That's in small groups. We know that parallel teaching, which we've talked about, is splitting that whole group in two. Why? So we can be more successful and provide more support to students. And also alternative teaching is pulling out a small group to provide additional support or enrichment and engagement to the students. I've said this before, even if there is only one teacher in the classroom, you can still teach in small groups. How you do it involves a lot of planning ahead of time, and it means that you're going to plan meaningful, independent work while you pull out the groups. So that independent work or collaborative work must be really thoughtful. So it could be stations, it could be work in computers or tablets, it could be some projects, but you have to plan that ahead and plan it well, not busy work. And as I've said before, you have to plan the timing for the different groups. You have to plan the groups, and those groups we'll talk about again, and the rotations have to be figured out ahead of time. And I've mentioned this before, but I want to mention it again now. I want to distinguish between small group instruction and group learning or cooperative learning. Just putting students in a group together does not mean they are learning. We've talked about if you're going to give them a task to do in a small group cooperative learning task where they're working on their own, that is great as long as they have clear guidelines and directions and we've created it so that every student has a chance to participate. What I'm talking about right now is not cooperative learning. I'm talking about small group instruction where the teacher is leading the instruction. It's teacher-led, highly structured. And but instead of doing that, which we traditionally do in a whole group, or what we think is easier to do in a whole group, I'm saying do that teacher-led, structured teaching part in small groups. Another piece to this is what Carol Ann Tomlinson talks a lot about is flexible grouping. And as we've mentioned before, we certainly can group our students by readiness or ability levels, but we don't want that to be the only way we group students. If we always break up by high, medium, and low, or however we're assessing students' abilities and creating the red group, the green group, the purple group, if we're only grouping them by ability, then really we're tracking within this classroom. So this is one very solid way to do it, but it's not what we want to do all the time. We don't want to pigeonhole kids, and we want to really encourage students to work with children, all the children in the class. Why? Because we know that research tells us that students benefit by working with a heterogeneous group of students. So how do we group? Well, one is by ability, the other is by learning style, perhaps, and I should really change that to learning profile, but it could be the same by learning multiple intelligences. It could be by students' interests, could be by their friendships. I have no problem with students choosing to work with students that they like, as long as they can work together. Obviously, you know which students who are going to just chat and get off topic and aren't going to do well together, but there's no reason that students can't work with peers that they get along well with. Sometimes we create balanced groups. So we might want every group to have really strong writers, weak writers, and students in the middle, for example. So that's not uncommon that we'll say we want to purposely make that a balanced group. It could be completely random. So however you do that, some teachers pick out of popsicle sticks to select groups. You have I know on smartboards have, random student generators where they will select students for you. There's any number of ways. You could just count off, but that's not a bad way to select your groups sometimes. And of course, you must consider the behavior of students when you make groups. So there are certain students who cannot work together. There are some students who can only work with some students. So you have to consider the behavior. So don't put students into groups that are going to fail. Use your observations and plan them carefully. So I know I've just given you a lot of work to do when it comes to groups, but when you know your students, this won't be so difficult. It will come naturally as you're getting a lot of information from assessment and from observation. So let's talk about learning centers. We have talked about stations before, certainly in terms of a model of collaborative co-teaching where students rotate through different activities in the room, different stations, and all the stations, basically all the children do all the activities at the stations. Learning centers are different. They are, and I would like to say to our early childhood people, traditionally we use the word learning centers to think of room areas. So we have the block area, we have the dramatic play area, we have the writing center, and we have the science center, and we have the math manipulatives, and perhaps a research center. So we have these room areas. But I say that even in early childhood, learning centers should not just be stuff in an area of the room. Learning centers are multi-leveled activities that are related to a unit of study. So if it's related to the unit of study, we don't study the same thing all year. Therefore, our learning centers should not look the same all year. Our learning centers must be changing, and they should be changing based on the content of what we're teaching. Learning centers have very specific activities, as would your formal lesson, as would anything else you do. And learning centers also, what do we do at learning centers? So it could be, one thing that students can do is reinforcement and practice. So we have taught students a new concept, a new skill, new knowledge. And now we want children to practice that skill or reinforce their understanding of new vocabulary. So that might be something that they do in a learning center. It could also be an application of skills. So we've taught it, and now they are going to apply that knowledge to a problem. So we give them hopefully a real life or a meaningful problem to solve, and they have to use those skills that they have to solve the problem. Learning centers can be independent. You may assign a student to go to a center to work independently, or in some cases, we have students working in pairs, Yeah, I'm not a fan of more than pairs in learning centers, unless you have a lot of materials and you can have multiple small groups. But I don't want those groups to get too large. I want to emphasize that learning centers, although it's a term that we use widely in early childhood, and it's a central piece of of how children learn and how we teach in early childhood. Learning centers are appropriate for all grade levels. Learning centers are very appropriate for middle school and high school, as well as elementary schools. So, what kind of centers might we have in a school based center? Well, I mentioned a research center; those are really important. We certainly, should have math center, literacy center, writing centers. We now have e-centers. So centers don't always have to be a place in the room with materials. A learning center could be based off of a computer. So on that computer could be a video or an audio podcast. Um, and when I say a computer, obviously that could be a tablet or a handheld device. It could be a web based experience. The internet, there are a lot of great activities, online games and explorations and investigations that are online. There's also a lot of really poorly created internet activities, so pick them pick them cautiously. We also could have obviously PowerPoint or Prezi or a smart notebook activity right there on a small individual device for students to use. So this is technology gives us a lot of options. And I would say that in the middle schools and high schools, where I have introduced the idea of learning centers, trying to help teachers move away from the traditional, sort of like that original classroom video I showed you. The kids are sitting listening to the teacher. And I introduced the idea of getting kids moving and doing in middle schools and high schools. And one of the biggest problems or obstacles that teachers will suggest is that they have to share classrooms. An elementary teacher has his or her classroom for the entire day. Middle school and high school class teachers often have to share classrooms and move around. Often you have 3 minutes to get to another classroom and set up. So the idea of creating full, physical learning centers can be very challenging. But technology gives us the opportunity to make that happen quickly and seamlessly. So the next piece of differentiation that I would like to highlight is the idea of tiered instruction. You will be reading about tiered instruction from Carol Ann Tomlinson. So when we talk about tiers, not crying tears, obviously, we're talking about levels. And a nice, simple way in a classroom is to have 3 levels. Sometimes we have more than 3 levels. That's fine. When we do guided reading, where we have assessed students' abilities in a typical classroom, and by the way, guided reading goes through 8th grade. If students are on level, we can certainly use guided reading in high schools with students with special needs who are reading below grade level, or perhaps with other struggling students. But in those cases, with reading levels, we often have multiple levels, and we might have 6 levels in a classroom. But I think 3 levels is a nice, simple way to think about high, medium, and low. So so what do we tier? What can we tier? We can tier our lessons. We can tier our assignments. So instead of everybody doing the same assignment, we can create 3 levels of assignments, 3 levels of complexity in the assignments. And we can very easily tier homework. When I say easy, I don't mean to suggest that doesn't involve work on your part, but I mean you plan it ahead of time and you simply give it out to them and assign it to them at the end of the day. You don't have to coordinate a lot during the day to make that happen as you do with differentiating your lessons or small groups. You can tier experiments. So you have a different set of instructions, or you have less instructions. Certainly, you can tier assessments and writing prompts. So when we think about tiering the content or modifying the content, we're thinking about the content, remember, is the what of the instruction, the what we're doing, the information, the ideas, the concepts, the facts, the vocabulary words, those informations. So we may give a different set of vocabulary words to different students. In fact, we should be giving a different set of spelling and vocabulary lists to students because we know that some students have already mastered that spelling and understanding of the set of words we've given out. And for other students, it's just too many. So that's a really important thing that we do. So one is differentiating the content by giving different information or different amount of information to our students. We can also differentiate our processes, and hopefully we are going to differentiate the process. So here's where we might have different tasks. So while they're working independently or working in small groups on projects or assignments, we are giving the task has a different level of intellectual demand. For some students, we might be giving more open-ended problems, whereas other students, they're more structured or guided. Certainly, inquiry-based learning would be more open-ended, where we give students more opportunity to figure out their path, and other students need that path towards learning a little more defined. We can have different kinds of exploration and discovery, self-directed learning, and a different level of responses that are expected of students. So we're just giving them, to simply put it, we're just giving them a different way to get to the same endpoint. There's a different path. We have the same endpoint. If we're just focusing on differentiating the process, the endpoint is the same. That content is the same. That knowledge, those skills are the same. But the way we get there is going to differ. Or the way the students are going to get there is going to be different because we've provided a different path for them to get there. And as I said before, we can also tier the product or the assessment, or how students show us what they've learned, how they've applied the skills, how they've developed, how they've answered problems or engaged in investigations. And in many cases, this would be self-selected. It can be. We want to teach students to figure out how they can show it to us. In a very traditional class, students just waiting for the directions from the teacher. They're not doing a lot of thinking on their own. We want students to be self-reflective of their own learning profiles, of their own preferences and abilities, and figure out what is the best way for them to demonstrate and show what they can do. And that could be self-evaluation. And those are very powerful ways for students to learn. one, I guess we'll share this when we talk about assessment a little bit more, but a real quick way to ask students to evaluate is, fist to five, your fist closed together is 0, I don't understand at all. 5, I've got a solid understanding. And we ask students to assess their understanding based on that. But again, we'll get into more self evaluation a little bit later in the semester. A really important part of differentiation, in my opinion, is providing multi-leveled reading for students. Traditionally, there was one text for all classes. We called it a basal reader in schools. So all the reading that everyone participated was in one book, and every student was expected to read the same book. And that goes on once we get to middle school and high school, and there's one textbook, and everybody is expected to read the same. What we know is that we have students who have different abilities to read, and if it's one text, they will struggle. So providing multi-levels of the same content, of the same subject matter, basically maximizes opportunities for kids to access that information. So we want to minimize whole group reading, whole group lessons. And I will say, the Common Core asks for students to read the same text at the same level. And that's where, and if that's the demand if that's in our required curriculum, if that's what's mandated by our schools, by our districts, by our states, then what we have to do is help students to access that reading differently. So we might provide excerpts or highlighting or shorter pieces, but ideally in classrooms, we are having both whole class readings and many opportunities to read on their grade level. So sometimes we can have a theme or a topic, and we might have students be in a group and every student is reading the same topic, but they're reading different books because those books are on a different level. And that's a really nice way to get your students of different ability levels to work cooperatively together, because the topic is the same, but the information that they're reading is accessed differently. Obviously, we can have related topics. So I want to say that having multiple reading levels should be an administrative task. It shouldn't be the task of the teacher to find multiple levels. Ideally, you are in a school where the principal, the building leader, the curriculum coordinator has already bought into the idea of one size reading doesn't fit all, and will not only provide you with the mandated curriculum, but provides you with some different options for students reading. But if that doesn't happen, then I think it is your responsibility to find it. I will say that over the last 30 some odd years since we've been talking about differentiated instruction, the job of finding multi-level tasks has gotten easier. We now have textbook companies that recognize the idea that all third grade students are not reading on the same level, and all sixth grade students are not reading on the same level. Yet all sixth grade students need to study Egypt, for example. So we have to provide multiple opportunities. So there are actually textbook companies that have multi-level texts. They may be geared for ESL students, but they work beautifully with students who have language-based learning disabilities. So those are really good to see now. We've talked a little bit before about guided reading. This picture here is a beautiful example of guided reading. The teacher has pulled a small group of students, 5 students, beautiful. I don't really like groups bigger than that. These students are all reading relatively on the same grade level. And here, the teacher can promote instruction by guiding them. She's going to listen to them. She's going to assess where they are. She might change the groups. She's going to teach a mini lesson. She's going to provide them with strategies for decoding complicated words. She's going to teach vocabulary. She's going to teach root words and so on. So guided reading is a great thing to do from pre-K or kindergarten through 8th grade minimally. And another piece of the guided, and the children are basically have a level from A to Z, and they move up on that ladder. Once students have mastered level Z, which is considered 8th grade reading level, we can now move into something called literature circles. But I'd like to also suggest that we can introduce literature circles at an earlier grade. So what are literature circles? Literature circles are, well, I like to think of it as the Oprah book club. So in the real world of adults who read for pleasure, like the book clubs that Oprah created, people get together and they discuss what they've read, and they have some guided questions, and they have some structure to, they're not just chit-chatting, but there are some set of questions that have been set up ahead of time. So literature circles are what we set up for students to do in small groups without us. We may teach them with us there, but ideally students are running their own literature groups. So they have read either a chapter or a page or an article. They've read something, and now they're coming together with some structure. And usually what we do in literature groups, as per my idea of everybody in the group has to have a different task. In a literature circle, everyone has a different task. So one student might be the questioner. One student might be the connector. One student might be the illustrator. One student might be the researcher. Anyway, we can have a variety of tasks for students, and we give them the opportunity to engage independently. And most importantly, they get to talk about what they read. And that is an awesome thing, because writing about what we read through summaries or book reports are not necessarily that interesting or engaging, and can really turn kids off of reading. So if we give kids more opportunity to talk in a structured way, in a planned and structured and guided way, then we're going to engage them in reading. And so in terms of multi-level reading in a differentiated classroom, we can actually put kids into a literature circle who have read different texts, but the topic is the same, and they can still engage in a conversation about the topic or the person or the point of history and so on. So we can talk about that later if you have some questions about literature circles. There's some great resources to help you set that up. Let's talk about anchor activities now. So anchor activities are to fill in the downtime in your curriculum. Well, they serve a lot of purposes. So certainly it can be when students have finished an assignment and now they're waiting for something else to do. So it's not that we're giving them busy work. We're giving them something meaningful to do. A do now which is something I don't know if you've seen, but we've certainly talked about. When students come into your class for the first time, either in the morning or after recess or after lunch, if you're an elementary school, or if you're a middle school or high school, they're starting their period in your class. So while they're coming in, the bell hasn't, everybody is not entering at exactly the same time. So there's a lag time between the first student entering and the last student entering. But the teacher is greeting students. The teacher may be checking in with the individual students. Here's a chance to see how a student is doing, build your relationship. You're also taking attendance. You might be getting your smartboard ready if you're a high school teacher and you've just gotten into the classroom. So a lot of things are happening at the beginning of a lesson or the beginning of this portion of the day. And if students don't have something to do, then we're, number one, wasting time, and two, is increasing the opportunity for students to go off task and get into trouble. So we want to make sure that students know there is always something that they have to do. So maybe some of these tasks are to complete an assignment. So some teachers have a progress folder, and students know they have a folder of work they haven't finished, and at any point they can go, and not at any point, at the points you've designated, certainly at a transition coming into the classroom or when they've finished an assignment, students know they can go to their folder and get out there, complete an assignment. Students also have to know what to do when they become stumped. So if this is an independent activity and you're working in a small group, you're leading a guided reading group, or you're leading a small group of science instruction, you can't answer students' questions. Students have to have a means in which they have to know what they can do during that time. So we want to make sure that these activities are respectful. We want to make sure that they're leveled to what the student needs, and they know what they have to do. Alternative homework, as I've indicated before, is a great way to differentiate. It's not more homework or less homework, it's just different homework. So you give students work that they can be, where they can be successful, and you give them work that doesn't frustrate them and that they can complete within a reasonable amount of time. Homework can be an extension of a differentiated classwork, as again, like in centers, it could be a reinforcement or practice or an application. Homework, in order to be effective, must be meaningful and respectful. So I would say that 25 math problems is not necessarily meaningful. And because the idea is, if you could do 3, you could do 5, you could do 10. So maybe we want to give less problems, but more different kinds of problems that ask students to be more creative. So the idea, and we want to be sure that we don't assign any homework that students cannot complete successfully independently. Really important. I'm going to say that again. Don't assign any homework that you know a student can't do. It sets them up for failure. So homework is really an easy way to differentiate, because you can think ahead of time about what a student can do, how long the assignment is, how complex the assignment is, and hopefully it will become meaningful and effective for students. I'd like to introduce you to the idea of curriculum compacting. So in the classroom where we're all not doing the same thing at the same time, there are we're basically allowing some students to not do some of the work. And we're allowing students to not do some of the work because they've already mastered it. So here is the steps in which we do it. And I'm sorry, I'm going to just go back a second. Traditionally, what we say to students is do it first, and then we'll give you more work to do. As I've suggested with our high-end students, this is not an effective strategy. However, giving them different work or compacting them out of what we're doing and assigning something else is a great way. So how do we do that? Well, first we have to assess what a student knows and what still needs to be mastered. So pre-assessment is crucial. The KWL chart that we've talked about a couple of times is one way. There are some teachers that give a quiz or an assignment, not an assignment, a quiz or a test at the unit test at the beginning. Not for grading, but just to see where the students are. You can do a pre-assessment by a discussion. There's any number of ways you can get information about what a student knows. So now, just because a student, let's say you're about to teach multiplication and you've got a student in class who is a fantastic multiplier. So not only can multiply 3 digits or 4 digits, but can do it fast and in his head. But that doesn't mean the student can apply that knowledge to solve problems. So instead of making this student who has really strong multiplication skills sit in for beginning multiplication instruction, we can say, we're going to stick to multiplication, but the student doesn't need to learn how to multiply. We're just going to work on problem solving. So first we assess what a student knows and identify what still needs to be mastered. And then we make a plan for learning what is not known. And we excuse that student from what is already known. Crucial. We don't make students sit and listen to instruction for information that they already know or skills they already have. So we have to plan for that freed up time. So now we've excused them from learning basic multiplication. So now we have to create an alternative plan for instruction. So with curriculum compacting, we may accelerate the work. We may say, we're going to move quick. We're going to work on multiplication for the student, but we're going to move quickly through that unit as opposed to the whole class that we're moving more slowly. We may eliminate some work altogether or a unit altogether. If you've got a student, and I'm sorry, I'm laughing. I'm thinking about a student I know who actually is on the autistic spectrum, and this kid knows absolutely everything there is to know about earthquakes. And he has obsessed over earthquakes since he's a young child. So if the unit is on earthquakes, there's really no value in having him learn from the beginning. But we have to replace that. And we replace it with something meaningful. I, however, don't want to give him a different topic to study. The student who has already mastered it. We've eliminated it. I want to replace it with something that may be within the topic. You can obviously replace it with anything else that you as the teacher find meaningful, but I think it's kind of nice to keep a kid in the community by keeping to the topic. So even if my boy is doing seismic measures and he's researching the earthquakes in various parts of the world and creating making predictions about when the next earthquake, even if that's what he's doing, at least he's on the topic of earthquakes and he can still be part of the classroom community. So curriculum compacting is going faster, eliminating entirely, or replacing that for more meaningful work for the students. In many cases, we give students an independent research project. I have also worked with a lot of students. Traditionally we call it distance learning, and there are many companies like Stanford University and Johns Hopkins that has accelerated or alternative programs, I should say, for gifted students on the computer. So you might have a student either engaged in an independent study or working on the computer at a very different level than the rest of the class. And I should say, you don't always have a student who is at such a different level who needs something entirely different, but you very likely are going to have some students who probably should compact out for some of the instruction throughout the year. So think about that. One strategy that I love is for every student to have a personal agenda. We can also think of it as a contract for learning. So an agenda is basically a list of tasks that the student can engage in when work is completed. You work that out with the student when they can engage in these tasks. You set it up for what that time is, and it can involve independent or collaborative work. Sometimes it has to be set, so that time interval, this is not the list has to be ongoing and changing. So the agenda might be, a 2 to 3 week period, and then you create a new agenda. Or else it doesn't work. So basically, students know what to do. This is, I guess, a form of an anchor activity. It fills in that downtime. A contract is a similar terminology, means the same thing. So it's teacher-directed independent work for the student. So you might have every single student. This is not just for the gifted student or the student who excels. I think every student should have a contract or an agenda that gives that student an idea of what they can do independently, some interests that they want to pursue, and really the goal of all teaching, of all school, is not for you to always be imparting information on the student. The goal is to get students to learn themselves, to learn independently. So this kind of strategy can really help all students, and I mean all students. I mean students with disabilities, students who struggle, ESL students. Every single student can be encouraged to follow an independent agenda and work independently and be less reliant on the teacher. But of course, the teacher has directed this agenda, so you're not just it's not total hands-off, but you're empowering students to take charge of their learning. Mentorships and apprenticeships are really powerful sources of learning for your students. It gives students a chance to work one-on-one. And who is that mentor or that mentor could be an administrator. It could be another teacher in the school. Very often a media specialist will work with students. It could be a parent volunteer, somebody from the community. This, again, goes hand in hand with a gifted student who is compacted out, who's working on an independent assignment, and just as easily with a student with disabilities. As a differentiated specialist in a particular school, I worked a lot with students with disabilities and did this. I was their mentor, and it was such an awesome opportunity because we did enrichment and engagement, and I taught skills at the same time, and it helped the student to be in the classroom because the student had the chance to really get some individual attention that was extremely challenging and personalized for him. And apprenticeships, Same thing where a student would have an opportunity to learn with somebody else. It could be somebody else in the district. If a student has a strong interest in social studies or science, maybe you can get another teacher in the school or district to work with a student and give them an opportunity to learn, because you do not have to be the expert of all things. You can use examples. You can use experts that are available to you. And that, by the way, your mentor or apprentice could be online. We have lots of opportunities for kids to Skype with experts. I've done that also, where we couldn't arrange it in person, but we could do it through technology. Last week in class, we talked about graphic organizers at the end. And graphic organizers are a really critical part of differentiated instruction, because we don't have to give the same graphic organizers to all students. So it's a great opportunity. As I said last week, graphic organizers help students to take notes, helps them to organize their information, also may help them present, to present or process their ideas. It also is a tool for us to evaluate or assess students' grasp of the materials. So I'm just going to quickly go through these. Sorry, that was a little too quickly. We did these last week. So the KWL chart, nice and simple, great strategy. You can do this as a whole, you could do this as a whole group activity, or students complete these and keep their own KWL chart individually. Venn diagrams for compare and contrast. This could be for vocabulary, geography, any kind of concepts. You can use this. A cause and effect chart such as this are great for historical events. It could also be for anything scientific, any kind of scientific inquiry or investigation or phenomena, where students can track, document, and keep track of events that change and the cause. We talked about the web, the very popular method of graphic organizer. This is great for brainstorming ideas, or also pulling out the details along with the central idea. Here's another main idea and details. And as I said last week, I would be putting lines on this for my students, because I think it helps students to stay focused. A story map, where students can keep track of what happened in the story. Instead of asking students to summarize what happens at the end of a chapter, I think a graphic organizer such as this is probably a little more powerful and easier for students, and I think more effective in helping them to focus on the key elements of the story. And as I said, there's Thinking Maps, which is a paid-for program that allows students and teachers to present information and to share their information in an organized fashion. So the task that I would love for you to do is to go onto the Moodle, if you haven't done that already, and download the glossary of differentiated strategies. And all I'm going to ask you to do is to read through this. You don't have to memorize it, but read through it and identify a couple of differentiated strategies that you like, that you would like to implement, and think about how you would implement that. Where, what kind of lesson, what subject area would you use that strategy? And on the same, at the same time, I would also like you to identify a couple of strategies that either you don't understand, you don't like, you can't imagine using, it doesn't fit with you, and I want you to think about why. And I'm not saying you should use them, but I'm just curious, and I want you to think about why. So, on that note, I wish you all a great week off, and I look forward to seeing you virtually next week in our video and in a couple of weeks in class in person. So, good night.